The Nexus station hummed with the constant chatter of 1,000 different species, their voices creating a symphony of alien languages that echoed through the massive corridors. Neon signs flickered in scripts that hurt human eyes to look at, advertising everything from quantum fuel to exotic pleasures that most civilizations couldn't even comprehend. The air recyclers worked overtime to accommodate the breathing requirements of dozens of different atmospheric preferences, creating pockets of sweet, sulfuric, and metallic scents that shifted like invisible tides. Marcus Chen sat in the shadow of a massive support beam, his weathered guitar case open before him, with barely enough credits to buy a single meal from the cheapest food vendor on the station. His clothes were patched and repatched, his boots held together with salvaged tape, and his face bore the hollow look of someone who hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 standard days. The guitar itself was a relic from old Earth, its wooden body scarred and its strings mismatched from countless repairs with whatever materials he could scrounge. He strummed a soft melody, fingers moving across strings that had been retuned so many times they barely held pitch. The music was gentle, melancholic, carrying the weight of memories from a world that no longer existed. Most passers-by ignored him completely. Humans were common enough on Nexus Station, but they were usually either wealthy traders, corporate executives, or military personnel. A human beggar was an oddity that most aliens simply stepped around like an interesting piece of debris. The Zephyrian delegation swept past him with their characteristic arrogance, their crystalline bodies chiming like wind bells with each step. Their leader, Ambassador Veltar, paused and looked down at Marcus with what might have been amusement in its faceted eyes. The translator collar around its neck crackled to life. "How fascinating," Veltar said, its voice carrying the harmonic overtones that made Zephyrian speech sound like singing. "A human reduced to begging. I thought your species prided itself on self-sufficiency and resilience." Marcus continued playing, not looking up. He'd learned that engaging with hostile aliens often led to worse situations than simply ignoring them. The melody he played was an old Earth song his grandmother had taught him, something about fields of grain and simple pleasures that seemed impossibly distant now. "Play for food," Veltar mocked, dropping a single micro-credit into the guitar case. The amount was so small it wouldn't buy a sip of recycled water. "How delightfully primitive. Tell me, human, what brought you to such reduced circumstances?" The small crowd of aliens that had gathered began to murmur among themselves. Marcus caught fragments of conversation through his translator implant. Comments about human weakness, speculation about his species' supposed inability to adapt to galactic civilization, jokes about Earth's destruction being a mercy for such a pathetic race. Still, Marcus played. The song shifted to something more complex, his fingers finding patterns that spoke of loss and endurance. He'd been a session musician on Earth before the Zephyrian bombardment, had played in studios and concert halls for audiences who understood the cultural weight of the melodies he created. Now those audiences were dust, and the only beings who heard his music were aliens who saw it as nothing more than an amusing curiosity. "I asked you a question, Beggar," Veltar pressed, its crystalline form flickering with internal light that indicated growing annoyance. "It's considered rude in most civilized cultures to ignore a direct query from a superior being." Marcus finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting the ambassador's multifaceted gaze. "Lost my world," he said simply, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Lost my family. Lost everything except this guitar. Playing is all I have left." The crowd of aliens shifted uncomfortably. The destruction of Earth was still a recent memory in galactic terms. Barely 50 standard years had passed since the Zephyrian Empire had decided that humanity's homeworld posed a potential future threat to galactic stability. The survivors had been scattered across the galaxy, most ending up as indentured laborers or worse. A few, like Marcus, had simply been lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of refugee processing. "Ah, yes," Veltar said, its voice taking on a tone of false sympathy. "The Earth incident, regrettable but necessary. Your species showed such aggressive tendencies. We simply couldn't risk allowing you to develop further." Marcus's fingers stilled on the strings. For a moment, the busy corridor seemed to grow quiet, as if the station itself was holding its breath. Then he resumed playing, but the melody had changed. It was still recognizably human music, but there was something different about it now, something that made several of the alien observers step back involuntarily. The music seemed to carry weight, emotion so raw and powerful that even beings without human cultural context could feel its impact. It spoke of cities burning, of children crying for parents who would never answer, of the desperate evacuation ships that had carried the lucky few away from their dying world. But more than grief, the music carried something else, a stubborn, defiant hope that refused to be extinguished. "Impressive," said a new voice from the crowd. A tall, reptilian saurian stepped forward, its scales shifting color in what Marcus had learned was a sign of interest. "The human creates sound patterns that trigger involuntary emotional responses even across species barriers. This is highly unusual." Marcus nodded to the saurian but continued playing. The melody evolved again, becoming something that spoke of survival against impossible odds, of the human capacity to endure and adapt. Several more credits appeared in his guitar case as other aliens began to recognize that what they were hearing was more than simple noise-making. "This is ridiculous," Veltar snapped, its crystalline body flickering with irritation. "You're all being manipulated by primitive emotional manipulation techniques. The human is using basic psychological triggers to elicit sympathy." But even as the ambassador spoke, more aliens were gathering. A group of insectoid hive workers stopped their constant bustling to listen. A family of gaseous nebula dwellers condensed their forms to better experience the vibrations. Even some of the station's security personnel, representing half a dozen different species, had paused their patrols to hear the strange human's music. Marcus transitioned into a song his father had taught him, something about workers coming home after long days in factories and mines. His voice, rough but surprisingly strong, began to carry the lyrics in the original Earth English. The translator collars around various aliens' necks struggled to convey the meaning, but somehow the emotion came through clearly regardless of language barriers. "You want to know what brought me here?" Marcus asked Veltar during a brief pause between verses. "I was on one of the last evacuation ships out of the Sol system. Ship got intercepted by pirates before we could reach the refugee processing centers. They killed most of the passengers, sold the rest into slavery. I escaped during a port stop, stole a shuttle, and crashed it trying to reach the nearest civilized system." He resumed playing, his fingers moving with increasing confidence as the crowd continued to grow. "Spent 5 years working asteroid mines to pay off the debt from my rescue. Ship owner claimed I owed him for the fuel it took to pick me up. When I finally got free, I found out the refugee processing centers had declared me dead. No identity, no citizen status, no rights under galactic law. So I play, and sometimes people give me enough credits to eat." The music built to something that was uniquely human, a combination of sorrow and joy, of loss and celebration, that spoke to the complex nature of human emotion. It was the sound of a species that had stared into the abyss and chosen to laugh instead of despair, that had lost everything and still found reasons to create beauty. A Vorthon merchant, its tentacles swaying in time with the rhythm, dropped a handful of credits into the case. "The human's soundcraft affects my pleasure centers," it announced to anyone listening. "This is a valuable skill." "Agreed," rumbled a massive Goliathan, its boulder-like form vibrating slightly with each bass note Marcus played. The small human creates harmony where there was discord. This has worth. Veltar's crystalline form was now flickering rapidly between colors, a sure sign of extreme agitation. This is preposterous. You're all being taken in by a clever con artist. Humans are known for their deceptive nature. But the crowd was no longer paying attention to the Zephyrian ambassador. They were focused entirely on Marcus and his music, which had evolved into something that seemed to speak directly to the soul of every being present, regardless of their species or background. It was a uniquely human gift, the ability to find common emotional ground, even among the vast diversity of galactic civilization. As the song reached its crescendo, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer just a homeless beggar hoping for enough credits to survive another day. Somehow, through the simple act of playing music, of expressing the indomitable human spirit through melody and rhythm, he had become something else entirely. The aliens around him were no longer just curious observers. They were an audience, and they were listening to him not out of pity or amusement, but with genuine appreciation for the art he was creating. For the first time since Earth's destruction, Marcus felt a spark of the pride that had once driven his species to reach for the stars. When the song ended, the silence that followed was profound. Then, almost as one, the assembled crowd began to express approval in the manner of their various species. Chittering, humming, color-shifting, or simply placing more credits in his guitar case. But Marcus wasn't looking at the credits anymore. He was looking at the faces around him, seeing something he hadn't seen in years. Respect. Not the grudging acknowledgement that humans sometimes received as useful laborers or soldiers, but genuine respect for human creativity and resilience. Veltar made a sound of disgust and began to push through the crowd, clearly intent on leaving. But as it passed Marcus, the ambassador paused and leaned down. "Don't think this changes anything, human," it whispered, its voice too low for the crowd to hear. "One talented beggar doesn't redeem an entire species. Your kind is still doomed to extinction and good riddance." Marcus looked up at the crystalline alien and smiled, not the desperate, pleading expression of a beggar, but the confident grin of someone who knew something his opponent didn't. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but you know what the difference is between humans and Zephyrians." He strummed a single, clear chord that seemed to hang in the air between them. "We don't need to destroy others to prove our worth. We create instead." Word of the human musician spread through Nexus Station like wildfire through an oxygen-rich atmosphere. Within hours of his confrontation with Ambassador Veltar, Marcus found himself at the center of something unprecedented in galactic history. Aliens actively seeking out human cultural expression, not as a curiosity, but as something of genuine value. The first to approach him formally was Dr. Zixara, a renowned Vorthon xenocultural researcher whose tentacled form rippled with the deep purple hues that indicated intense intellectual excitement. She had pushed through the crowd as it began to disperse, her translator collar crackling with rapid speech. "Human Marcus Chen," she said, consulting a datapad with 3 of her tentacles, while the others gestured expressively. "I have been studying cross-species artistic expression for 2 centuries, and what you accomplished here today should be theoretically impossible. Your music triggered positive emotional responses in 17 different species simultaneously, many of whom have completely incompatible neurological structures." Marcus packed his guitar carefully, still overwhelmed by the weight of credits in his case, more than he'd earned in the previous month combined. "It's just music," he said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. What had happened during his performance had been something more than entertainment. "No," Dr. Zixara replied firmly, her tentacles shifting to the orange patterns that indicated absolute certainty. What you created was a form of universal emotional communication. The mathematical patterns in your soundcraft correspond to neurological resonance frequencies that exist across multiple species barriers. This suggests that consciousness itself may have common structural elements that we never suspected. As they talked, more aliens began to approach. A delegation of crystalline singers, ethereal beings whose entire culture revolved around harmonic expression, materialized near Marcus with the soft, chiming sounds that indicated deep interest. Their leader, a being whose translucent form seemed to contain entire galaxies of swirling light, communicated through musical tones that his translator collar rendered as formal, archaic language. "Small flesh, one who weaves harmony," the crystalline singer sang. "We request knowledge sharing. Your soundcraft contains mathematics unknown to our archives. We offer trade value for learning opportunity." Marcus stared at the ethereal being, hardly believing what he was hearing. The crystalline singers were legendarily reclusive, considering most other species too crude to appreciate their art. The idea that they wanted to learn from a human beggar was staggering. "I don't understand," Marcus said honestly. "I'm not a teacher. I just play what I feel." "That is precisely the miracle," Dr. Zixara interjected, her tentacles now cycling through rapid color changes that indicated intense theorizing. "You create art without mathematical frameworks or harmonic algorithms. Your music emerges directly from emotional experience, unfiltered by intellectual analysis. For most species, this would result in chaotic noise. But human neural architecture apparently allows for intuitive pattern creation that produces mathematically elegant results." The crowd around them continued to grow, but Marcus noticed that the composition was changing. Where before he'd attracted mostly casual passers-by, now he was seeing representatives from major galactic institutions. A group of scholars from the Universal Archive were recording everything on quantum storage devices. Several news service representatives were broadcasting live feeds across the galaxy. Most remarkably, a small contingent of Galactic Council junior ambassadors had arrived and were observing from a respectful distance. "This is unprecedented," whispered one of the archive scholars, an elderly Nexarian whose cybernetic implants glowed with the soft blue light of intensive data processing. "When was the last time a single individual triggered this level of interspecies interest? The implications for xenosociology are staggering." Marcus felt a growing unease as the attention intensified. He had sought only enough credits for a meal, but somehow his simple act of playing music was becoming a galactic phenomenon. The weight of so many alien eyes upon him was overwhelming, and he found himself unconsciously gripping his guitar case tighter. "Perhaps," Dr. Zixara suggested, noticing his discomfort, "we could continue this discussion in a more private setting. I maintain research facilities on this station, and you appear to need time to process these developments." Before Marcus could respond, the crowd suddenly parted to reveal Ambassador Veltar, returning with a full diplomatic escort. The Zephyrian's crystalline form was flickering with the deep red hues that indicated official displeasure, and the armed guards surrounding it represented several species known for their loyalty to Zephyrian interests. "This gathering is hereby declared unlawful under Galactic Security Statute 7.3, Veltar announced, its voice amplified by portable speakers. "Nexus Station Administration has received reports of a potentially dangerous human using unknown psychological manipulation techniques to influence alien behavior. For public safety, this individual must be detained for examination." The assembled crowd reacted with a mixture of confusion and anger. Several of the more powerful aliens present began to voice their objections, but Veltar's guards moved to establish a perimeter around Marcus. The ambassador's strategy was clear. If it couldn't dismiss human artistic ability as worthless, it would instead frame it as a threat. "Under what authority?" demanded Dr. Zixara, her tentacles now blazing with the crimson patterns that indicated pure fury. This human has committed no crime. He was engaged in legitimate cultural expression. Zephyrian intelligence has evidence that humans possess latent psychic abilities that manifest as emotional manipulation, Veltar replied smoothly. Given this species' known aggressive tendencies, we cannot risk allowing such abilities to develop unchecked. The human will be transferred to appropriate containment facilities for study. Marcus stood slowly, his guitar case clutched in his hands. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years invisible to galactic civilization, ignored and overlooked. Now, the moment anyone paid attention to his humanity, it was being declared a threat that needed to be contained. "I'm not psychic," he said clearly, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "I'm just a musician whose world was destroyed by people who were afraid of what humans might become." "Silence!" snapped one of the guards, a heavily armored Brutok whose species had served Zephyrian interests for millennia. "You will come with us willingly or be taken by force." But as the guard stepped forward, something unexpected happened. The crystalline singers, who had been observing silently, suddenly began to produce a harmonic pattern that Marcus recognized. It was based on the melody he had played earlier, but transformed into something more complex and powerful. The sound wasn't just music. It was a form of sonic shield that caused the approaching guards to stumble and retreat. "Harmony Creator is under song protection," the lead singer announced, its voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. "Zephyrian dominance seekers will not silence music gift." Other aliens in the crowd began to voice their own objections. The Vorthon scholars surrounded Marcus in a protective circle, their tentacles weaving barrier patterns in the air. The massive Goliathan who had listened to his music earlier moved to block the guards' advance, its stone-like form immovable. Even some of the Galactic Council representatives began to step forward. "This is exactly what we feared," Veltar declared, its crystalline form now pulsing with urgent signals to its guards. "The human's manipulation abilities are spreading to other species. This confirms the threat assessment. The only threat here is your determination to suppress anything you can't control," Marcus said, setting down his guitar case and opening it. He pulled out his battered instrument, his fingers finding familiar chords. "You're so afraid of what humans represent that you'll turn music into a crime." As he began to play, something remarkable happened. The various aliens who had formed a protective circle around him began to add their own voices to his music. The crystalline singers provided harmonic accompaniment. The Vorthon scholars created rhythmic patterns with their tentacle movements. The Goliathan's massive form became a bass resonator that made the melody felt as much as heard. What emerged was a form of music that had never existed in galactic history, a truly collaborative composition that transcended species barriers. It wasn't human music or alien music. It was something entirely new, born from the combination of human creativity and alien technical mastery. The effect on the gathered crowd was immediate and profound. More aliens began to join the impromptu orchestra, each adding elements unique to their species' capabilities. The Saurian delegation provided percussion with their clawed feet. A group of energy-based Lumarians created visual accompaniment with controlled light displays. Even some of Veltar's own guards began to lower their weapons, clearly affected by the unprecedented display of interspecies cooperation. "Stop this!" Veltar commanded, its voice rising to painful harmonics. "I order you to disperse immediately." But for the first time in galactic history, aliens from dozens of different species were ignoring Zephyrian authority. They were too caught up in the wonder of what they were creating together. A new form of art that none of them could have imagined individually, but that somehow felt completely natural when experienced as a group. Marcus realized that what was happening around him was bigger than music, bigger than his personal survival, bigger even than the fate of the scattered human refugees. It was a fundamental shift in how different species related to each other, enabled by humanity's unique gift for finding common emotional ground. The music built to a crescendo that seemed to make the station itself vibrate in harmony. When it finally ended, the silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. Aliens who had never spoken to each other before were looking at their fellow participants with new recognition and respect. Veltar's crystalline form was flickering with rapid color changes that indicated extreme agitation. The ambassador's guards stood uncertainly, clearly affected by what they had witnessed, but still bound by their orders. "This changes nothing," Veltar said finally, though its voice lacked its earlier confidence. "One incident of mass manipulation doesn't alter the fundamental security threat posed by human survivors. If anything, it confirms the necessity of containment protocols." But as the ambassador spoke, Marcus noticed something that filled him with quiet hope. Among the crowd of aliens who had participated in the spontaneous concert, small groups were forming, musicians and scholars and ordinary citizens who were already discussing the possibility of future collaborations. Seeds had been planted that would be difficult for any authority to uproot. The human beggar who had sat in the shadow of a support beam that morning was gone. In his place stood something that the galaxy hadn't seen before, a bridge between species, a living example of what cooperation could achieve when fear was set aside. Marcus picked up his guitar and looked directly at Ambassador Veltar. "You want to contain the threat humanity represents?" he asked quietly. "Too late. The music is already out there." 6 months later, the Cultural Exchange Pavilion on Nexus Station bore little resemblance to the sterile commercial corridor where Marcus had once begged for food credits. The massive space now housed the first Galactic Harmony Institute, its walls lined with performance areas designed to accommodate the biological needs of dozens of different species. What had begun as a single human musician's desperate attempt to survive had evolved into something that was reshaping interstellar civilization. Marcus stood on the central stage, no longer the hollow-eyed beggar who had clutched a battered guitar case. His clothes were simple but clean, his face filled out from regular meals, and his hands showed the calluses of someone who spent hours each day creating music. Around him, the most accomplished artists from across the galaxy were gathered for the Institute's inaugural concert, an event that had drawn representatives from every major galactic power. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. Ambassador Veltar's initial attempt to have Marcus detained had failed when too many influential aliens intervened, but the Zephyrian Empire had continued to pressure the Galactic Council to classify human survivors as a potential security threat. The debate had raged for months in council chambers and academic forums, with humanity's fate hanging in the balance. The breakthrough had come when Dr. Zixara published her research on cross-species emotional resonance. Her data proved that humans weren't using psychic manipulation or technological trickery. They simply possessed an unusual form of neural architecture that allowed them to unconsciously identify and reproduce mathematical patterns that triggered positive responses across multiple species. It wasn't a weapon, it was a gift that could benefit all galactic civilization. "Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings of all classifications," Dr. Zixara announced from the pavilion's central podium, her tentacles shimmering with excitement. "Today marks a historic milestone in interstellar cultural development. For the first time, we will experience a truly collaborative musical composition involving 37 different species working in perfect harmony." The audience was unlike anything ever assembled in galactic history. Crystalline singers floated in specially designed zero-gravity alcoves. Aquatic deep swimmers observed from pressurized water chambers. Energy beings had been provided with harmonic resonance amplifiers that would allow them to participate directly in the performance. Representatives from the Galactic Council, including several who had initially opposed the Institute, sat in the front rows with expressions of curiosity rather than suspicion. Notably absent was Ambassador Veltar. The Zephyrian Empire had officially boycotted the event, though Marcus had spotted several Zephyrian observers in the crowd wearing civilian clothes. Even the most hardline opponents of human integration seemed unable to resist witnessing what was being called the most significant artistic event in recorded galactic history. Marcus stepped forward to the center of the performance area, carrying the same scarred guitar that had started everything. But now it had been carefully restored by master craftsmen from a dozen different worlds. Its wooden body bearing inlaid patterns contributed by various species as gifts. The crystalline singers had woven harmonic resonators into its structure. Vorthon engineers had enhanced its electronic pickups. Saurian metalworkers had crafted new strings from alloys that could reproduce frequencies no human ear had ever heard. 6 months ago, Marcus began, his voice carried to every corner of the pavilion by translation systems that rendered his words in hundreds of languages simultaneously. I sat in a corridor not far from here, hungry and alone, playing music just to survive another day. I thought I was just a refugee, a leftover from a dead world with nothing to offer this vast galaxy. He strummed a soft chord, the sound rippling through the assembled crowd with crystal clarity. But I learned something that day that changed everything. Music isn't about the musician. It's about the connections we create when we listen to each other, really listen, and find the patterns that unite us despite our differences. The first movement began with Marcus playing a simple melody, recognizably human in its emotional structure, but enhanced by the technical improvements that alien craftsmanship had added to his instrument. The sound was fuller, richer, and somehow more expressive than anything he had produced before. It was still fundamentally human music, but it had been elevated by the contributions of other species. As the melody established itself, other performers began to join in. The crystalline singers added harmonic layers that seemed to make the very air shimmer with color. A group of rhythmic drummers from the percussion-obsessed Banthar Collective provided a backbone of complex beats that somehow perfectly complemented the human emotional patterns. Vorthon scholars contributed mathematical precision that transformed Marcus's intuitive compositions into something that approached musical perfection. The second movement showcased compositions that had been created jointly by mixed-species groups working together at the Institute over the previous months. These pieces were unlike anything that had existed before. They couldn't have been created by any single species alone, but required the unique capabilities of multiple civilizations working in harmony. The result was music that seemed to speak directly to the consciousness of every being present, regardless of their biological or cultural background. But it was the third movement that truly demonstrated what the Institute represented. Marcus stepped back and gestured for the audience themselves to participate. What followed was improvisation on a scale never before attempted. Hundreds of beings from dozens of species, each contributing their own voice to a musical conversation that had no predetermined structure or conclusion. The sound that emerged defied description. It was chaos that somehow resolved into harmony, complexity that felt completely natural, creativity unleashed on an interstellar scale. Individual voices could be heard within the greater composition. The whistle clicks of cetacean refugees, the crystalline chimes of energy beings, the bass rumbles of massive titans, but they all combined into something that was greater than the sum of its parts. For nearly an hour, the improvisation continued to evolve, with different species taking turns leading melodic lines, while others provided support. The music told stories of worlds beyond counting, of civilizations rising and falling, of the lonely spaces between stars, and of the connections that could bridge any distance when beings chose to listen to each other with open hearts. When the music finally wound down to silence, the pause that followed seemed to stretch across eternity. Then, slowly, applause began. Not the polite recognition that typically followed diplomatic events, but genuine enthusiasm that transcended species barriers. The sound was a symphony in itself, as different civilizations expressed appreciation according to their own cultural traditions. Marcus found himself surrounded by performers from across the galaxy, beings he had worked with over the past months to develop the new collaborative techniques. Dr. Zixara was there, her tentacles glowing with pride. The lead crystalline singer had condensed its form to communicate directly with him. Representatives from the Galactic Council were making their way onto the stage, clearly intent on formal recognition of what they had witnessed. Human Marcus Chen, announced Councillor Thranks, a senior representative whose species had remained neutral in most galactic political disputes. By unanimous vote of the attending council members, the Galactic Assembly hereby recognizes the artistic and cultural contributions of humanity to galactic civilization. Furthermore, we formally request the establishment of Harmony Institutes on all major trading stations and colony worlds. The crowd erupted in celebration, but Marcus found himself looking beyond the pavilion to the viewing ports that showed the vast sweep of space beyond the station. Out there, scattered across hundreds of worlds, were the remaining survivors of humanity, refugees and laborers and forgotten individuals who had been written off as the remnants of a failed species. "There's something else," Marcus said, his voice somehow cutting through the celebration. The crowd gradually quieted, sensing that he had more to say. "The music we created here tonight wasn't just about art. It was about proving that different doesn't mean dangerous, that diversity creates strength rather than weakness." He gestured toward the viewing port. "There are humans out there who still believe they have nothing to offer this galaxy, just like I did 6 months ago. There are aliens who still think cooperation is impossible because we're too different from each other. But tonight proved that when we choose to listen instead of fear, when we create together instead of destroying what we don't understand, we can achieve things that none of us could imagine alone." The crystalline singer beside him began to glow with patterns that indicated agreement. "Truth Speaker Harmony Creator speaks wisdom words," it sang. "Fear patterns create silence death. Harmony patterns create music life." Dr. Zixara stepped forward, her datapad displaying the recordings from the evening's performance. The mathematical analysis of tonight's improvisational sequence shows patterns of complexity that would require quantum supercomputers to calculate artificially. But when beings work together in genuine cooperation, such complexity emerges naturally. This represents a new form of consciousness, not individual or collective, but collaborative. Councillor Thranks nodded slowly, its ancient face showing an expression that might have been wonder. "What you're describing has implications far beyond artistic expression. If different species can create such harmony in music, what might be possible in science, in exploration, in the very structure of galactic civilization itself?" Marcus smiled, remembering the desperate beggar who had sat in a station corridor with an empty guitar case and an empty stomach. That person seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different life entirely. But in another sense, nothing had fundamentally changed. He was still just a human who played music, trying to make connections in a vast and often lonely universe. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think that's the point. We'll never know what's possible until we try, and the first step is always the same. We put down our weapons, pick up our instruments, and start making music together." The celebration continued late into the station's night cycle, with impromptu concerts breaking out in corridors and common areas throughout Nexus Station. Beings who had never spoken to each other before were sharing songs and stories. Long-standing diplomatic tensions were being dissolved in the simple act of creating beauty together. As Marcus finally made his way back to his quarters, no longer a shelter for refugees but a proper apartment near the Institute, he paused at a viewing port to look out at the stars. Each point of light represented civilizations beyond counting. Worlds where beings struggled with the same fears and hopes that had driven galactic politics for millennia. Somewhere out there, Ambassador Veltar was probably filing reports about the dangerous influence of human cultural contamination. Other voices would be calling for restrictions, for controls, for the familiar comfort of separation and suspicion. But also out there were the seeds that had been planted tonight. The idea that cooperation was not only possible but beautiful, that diversity was a source of strength rather than conflict, and that the universe was vast enough to hold all the different ways that consciousness could express itself. Marcus pulled out his guitar and played a soft melody as he watched the stars. It was a simple tune, nothing fancy, just the sound of a human being grateful to be alive in a universe full of wonders. But as he played, he noticed that the station's ambient sound seemed to shift and harmonize with his music. The hum of life support systems, the distant chatter of alien voices, even the rhythm of footsteps in nearby corridors. The galaxy was learning to sing in harmony, and for a species that had lost its homeworld but found its voice among the stars, that was more than enough reason to keep making music.